Good morning. I'm Massimiliano Menghini, and this is my research presentation titled Autonomous Underwater Vehicle Actuators Health Monitoring for Smart Harbour Application. Before start with the presentation, I would like to thank the Interreg Italy-Croatia Sushidrop project that has supported this work. In particular, the aim of the Sushidrop project is to design and test an autonomous underwater vehicle for underwater habitats biological research in the Adriatic Sea. I'm just going to start with a brief introduction of this work. Nowadays, autonomous vehicles have become an integral part of the smart city environment. Autonomous ground and aerial vehicles are included into the transport of this environment. Instead, autonomous underwater vehicles are not yet part of it. So the question is, why is it still difficult to consider AUV as an integral part of smart cities? The main reasons are three: high cost, hostile underwater environment, and stringent regulations. In order to facilitate the introduction of underwater vehicles in smart cities, it is necessary to solve issues such as reliability, availability, and operating safely, while maintaining desirable performances. Therefore, it is necessary to implement in these vehicles health monitoring systems. So, with this site, this research addresses the fault diagnosis problem of actuator of the ODIN autonomous underwater vehicle. The mathematical model used is the nonlinear 6 degree of freedom Fossen model. For fault scenario of the actuators, we consider multiple simultaneous actuator faults in presence of marine current and measurement disturbances. The objective is to design an health monitoring for actuators by using a new methodology, that is the nonlinear geometric approach. So our aim is to design a dedicated residual set of scalar filters applied to this ODIN AUV. Before starting with the implementation of the fault detection and isolation scheme, I will introduce the mathematical model of the UUV. The mathematical model used is the Fossen model. So a generic unmanned underwater vehicle is modeled as a 6 degree of freedom rigid body, and it is described with kinematics and dynamics equation. The kinematics equation are related to the two following vectorial equations. The first one describes the translational motion of the center of gravity, while the second one describes the rotational motion about the center of gravity. These two equations will be expressed in compact form, as you see here throughout this research. In order to derive the marine craft equation of motion, it is necessary to study the motion of rigid bodies, hydrodynamics, and hydrostatics. And according to Fossen, the rigid body dynamic can be expressed in vectorial form, as you can see here, where M, C, D, and G are respectively the system inertial matrix, the Coriolis centripetal matrix, the damping matrix, and the vector of gravitational and buoyancy forces. It is important to underline that tau is the vector of control input, expressed in inertial forces and inertial moments. So, the 6 degree of freedom equation of marine craft could be expressed with this system, and it is worth observing that tau has to be modeled in terms of thruster. Indeed, tau is equal to V times U, where V is the thruster control matrix. It means that it's a matrix that maps thruster forces into forces and moments. And this kind of expression is fundamental for our aim. Indeed, we want to design a fault detection and isolation scheme for actuators. But what is the fault detection and isolation problem? Starting from the definition of fault, it is an unpermitted deviation of at least one characteristic property of the system from the nominal condition. So the fault detection and isolation problem consists in monitor a system identifying when and where a fault has occurred. We can monitor a system with a proper design of residual signal, that is a fault indicator, and generally the structure of the residual is 0 or close to 0 when no fault is present, and different from 0 when a fault occurs. In this research, the actuator fault diagnosis is addressed with a model-based approach. So the detection and isolation of fault of the system is achieved by comparing the available system measurement with those ones obtained by using observer or filters based on the mathematical model of the system through the generation of residual quantities and their comparisons. So the residual design is achieved exploiting the nonlinear geometric approach methodology. And with this methodology, it was possible to design a dedicated residual set in which each residual is sensitive to a single fault and decoupled from the others. Doing so, all faults can be detected simultaneously. The nonlinear geometric approach methodology is based on nonlinear system description affine in input, as shown here. And this methodology allows to theoretically inspect if a fault could be detected and isolated. The algorithm starts with the computation of the characteristics set of the nonlinear geometric approach in order to determine if the fault signature belongs or not to the given distribution calculated in the first two steps. If the check at the third step is passed, a suitable change of coordinate exists. So you can determine a subsystem that is affected by the fault and decoupled from the disturbances. Here on the top, there is the new subsystem. And as you can see, the equation in blue are directly affected by the fault and decoupled from the disturbances. Therefore, it is possible to isolate the blue subsystem to design the filter that will constitute the residual generation for the fault detection and isolation. It is worth observing that the subsystem is possible to choose a scalar variable that is directly affected by the fault. Therefore, you can design a scalar filter as shown here in the black system. In this research, the vehicle considered is the ODIN AUV, and that is a spherical shaped vehicle with 6 thrusters configuration, allowing a 6 degree of freedom motion. You can see here the ODIN AUV model in a state space form. And it is important to underline that all the matrices of the mathematical model are known and are the matrices of the ODIN AUV. And also, it is worth observing that we are dealing with the diagnosis of fault of actuators. So the fault signature matrix E is equal to the thruster control matrix P. To apply the nonlinear geometric approach algorithm, it is necessary to manipulate the system, the ODIN AUV system, in order to obtain the generic nonlinear description of the methodology. And as you can see here, this is the model of the ODIN AUV expressed in the generic nonlinear description. And of course, the objective is to design scalar residual generators sensitive to a given fault and decoupled from the others. This means that the nonlinear geometric approach algorithm is computed to each actuator fault. So at the end of the computation, we get 6 scalar residual filters that will compose our dedicated residual set. In this slide, is reported an example of the design of the first residual actuator. You have to define the fault signature L and the disturbance matrix P. After that, you can compute the nonlinear geometric approach algorithm, and you will find a change of coordinate. In this case, only the red variable are directly affected by the fault on the first actuator. So, computing the dynamics of the first variable, it is possible to obtain the scalar residual sensitive to a fault on the first actuator, as you can see here. And this process was repeated for each actuator fault. This slide shows the Simulink implementation of the ODIN AUV. And as you can see in figure, the blue block is the C current model. The orange block represents the dynamic ODIN AUV model. The green one instead is the kinematic part. And here there is a zoom of the kinematic part in which we also implemented the C current model. In order to perform a high fidelity simulation, we also introduced measurement noise and marring current. The C current is supposed to be 2D irrotational, and it's modeled as a ramp with a magnitude of 1 knot. The measurement noise are modeled with normally distributed white noise based on real sensors that we are using in the Sushidrop project. The threshold values are fixed in a fault-free condition in accordance with the 3 sigma rule. And several simulations of the faulty cases of the ODIN AUV were performed considering different maneuvers and in presence of marring current and measurement noise. For a better understanding of the result, we recall that the red lines refer to the residual response in the fault-free case. The blue ones are the responses of the residual in the faulty case, and the black lines are the threshold. For time reason, will be presented only 3 fault scenarios. The first one scenario is a fault on the first actuator. This is the dedicated residual set, and during the simulation, a fault on the first actuator is injected into the system. And as you can see here, by simply checking which residual response is different from 0, it is possible to understand where a fault has occurred. And in this case, only the first residual exceeds the threshold, meaning that a fault has occurred on the first actuator. In this simulation, instead, it's presented a fault on the fourth actuator. Indeed, as you can see, only the residual 4 exceeds the threshold, while the other residuals behavior coincide with the one of the fault-free case. Indeed, in the latter is presented a simultaneous fault scenario. During the simulation, were injected 2 faults at different times, one on the 5th actuator and the second on the 6th actuator. Indeed, as you can see, the dedicated residual set responds indicating that faults have occurred on the 5th and on the 6th actuator. To conclude, this work proposed a new methodology based on a nonlinear geometric approach and the Fosse model for actuators for detection and isolation of the ODIN AUV. And some consideration has to be done. The dedicated residual set designed allows a complete diagnosability of all actuator faults that could be present in the system. Also, this dedicated residual set is based on scalar filters, resulting in a low computational burden. Therefore, they are suitable for real case implementation. And the proposed health monitoring system is necessary for Smart Harbour Application and certification by the European Maritime Safety Agency. In the next future, the proposed fault detection and isolation scheme will be implemented into the Sushidrop AUV. Thanks for your kind attention.